Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we'll be looking at ethical theories in the most applied way, through the kinds of answers you give to a series of questions called the ethics survey. I have my students take that survey at the beginning of the semester before we ever touch ethical theories. And then they take the exact same survey at the end of the semester when they should be able to better understand the implications of their answers. So today, we're going over those questions and noting which ethical theory they belong to, but really focusing on which answers are inherently incompatible. In other words, we're looking to make sure that our ideas on ethics are actually coherent and stable. The survey itself is available at my blog, link in the description. Feel free to use it as you like, just credit it back to me. If you have not taken the survey, I suggest you do that first. It's only 13 yes or no questions with a single follow-up question each. It will make the exploration here more effective. Alright, if you're continuing on, let's get to it. Now, we're not doing these questions in order, and that's because the survey intentionally scatters groups of questions. Instead, we're doing them by the type of ethical theory. So first up, we have deontic ethics, including Kantian ethics and religious ethics. And there we have our question 1. Do you believe that there are universal and objective rights? And that means rights that apply to everyone, everywhere, at all times, rights which do not depend on preferences, attitudes, and the willingness of people to respect them. Now, this includes everything from the right to life, to liberty, to non-slavery, right to not be physically or sexually abused, and so on. Deontic ethics have an absolute standard that cannot be violated for any reason, ever. In strictly Kantian ethics, most rules seem to fall into this absolute standard, but that's not a necessary feature of all deontic ethics. Religious ethics, for example, tend to have a series of core rules that are absolute, and the rest work in different ways. There may not be a lot of things in this position, but they do have to be there. The idea of objective and universal, meaning that there are never exceptions, is precisely the idea that consequences do not matter. The second question was, do you believe that there are universal and objective responsibilities? That means responsibilities that apply to everyone, everywhere, if the situation comes up, responsibilities which do not depend on the preferences, attitudes, and the willingness of people to carry them out. Here's a trick. Both question 1 and 2 are actually the same question. To have a right is to have a responsibility to ensure that right is protected and enforced. Without an accompanying responsibility, there is no right. Similarly, a moral responsibility can exist only if there is a right to the act. So you can't have a moral responsibility to do something that is morally impermissible. Like, if rape is morally impermissible, you can't have a responsibility to commit rape. If you have no right to represent some group of people, you can't have the responsibility to do so. Anyway, if we take the position that sexual assault is always wrong, which is our question 13, then there is a right to be free from sexual assault. And that means that there is a corresponding responsibility to prevent sexual assault. That responsibility includes prevention for others and prevention for yourself. That is, you have a moral responsibility to protect yourself from the same kinds of harms that you ought to protect others from, and vice versa. Now, just about all people who take the survey agree that sexual assault is always wrong, but relatively few connect that idea with the idea of rights and responsibilities. So, in other words, people know that an act is bad, but they have no idea what makes it morally bad. And that means that they have no idea about their own moral obligations if they hold that position. Then we have question number 10. Do you believe that there is a way in which human beings should never act and a way in which they always should? This question is related. A way you can never act means that you never have the moral right to do some act X, and neither does anyone else. This is a universal, objective moral obligation. If there is a way that you should always act, then you have a moral responsibility to do some act X, and so does everyone else. Notice also that any positive obligation, like do X, always has a reverse negative obligation. Do not do the opposite of X, and vice versa. Also notice that the phrasing here makes it universal, so that it applies to all people alike. And that means, again, that if no one should do X, then you ought to prevent X from happening, and so on and so forth. These are clearly deontic, that is, Kantian and religious premises. The underlying basis is the idea of absolute values at the core, which are not subject to society or preference or costs or anything else. And so we get to question number 9. Do you believe that, quote, doing the right thing, end quote, is more important than having a good outcome? You should be able to see this for a question of utilitarian or deontic values a mile off, but let's walk our way through it. The question itself carries the assumption that there is an objective and right thing to do. Without that deontic idea, how exactly would something with a bad outcome be considered good? The second point of the question is the idea of costs and consequences as irrelevant. That is, the moral obligation, as per our reading about math roads, is more important. This echoes the question 13 point, that there are absolute rules and values which can never be sacrificed to anything higher than them because there is nothing ranked higher in the hierarchy of values. Turning to group 2, the questions of utilitarianism. And here we can go back to all of the questions in the deontic group, but just take the flip answers to be an indication of utilitarianism. But we also have a bunch of utilitarian specific questions, so let's look at those instead. Question number 7 asks, do you believe that all the rules of right and wrong are up to us? That is, that we, individuals and societies, are the only deciders of what is right and wrong. Obviously, this position negates the deontic one, because the rules in deontic systems are absolute. They're not subject to Bob and Steve. But utilitarianism argues that there are no absolutes. Instead, it is the society that decides the right and wrong, and they decide this on the basis of happiness at the outcome. Whatever the people want, whatever will make them the most happy with the least pain, is the thing to do. And since we decide what those things are, society makes the rules. Question 8 follows on the heels of question 7. Do you believe that a society should be run by agreement of its members? That is, that the members should have the power to change the rules of society in any way at any time. Well, if you believe in deontic ethics, then the answer is no, because the rules are not set by society. But if the idea of right and wrong depends on people, then there is no other possible source of right and wrong other than people. And thus, if we were to decide that murder, theft, rape, and so on was good, then it is. And if the pain suffered as a result was less than the happiness produced, then who cares what the rule is, since all we're doing is maximizing happiness? There is no external standard to use, and therefore our preference is everything. Question number 6 asked, do you believe that it is acceptable to act in a way that helps out the majority of people, even though some people will be worse off because of it? And most students answered yes. And this is the basis of utilitarian thought. But note that the harm to be suffered by the minority here is not specified. Anything goes, so slavery, extermination, and so forth. And if we expand the idea to a global one, as per globalization, then all humans are included. And so the minority position gets precarious really fast. Our question about sexual assault, question number 13, plays a role here again. If there is no objective external standard, and we are the source of values, then it is not true that sexual assault is never justified. In fact, it would be justified the moment that saying yes to sexual assault was better for happiness than saying no. Now, it might take some extreme circumstances to make that happen, but it can happen. That is, there is a situation where sexual assault would be morally justified. By the way, I'm not advocating for the position, I'm just saying that the math can come out that way in utilitarianism. Then we have questions 3, 4, and 5 on ending life, abortion, and freedom of speech, and they're all equally up to the majority will. Your right to autonomy is great until taking it away is better in utility. So is the right to abortion. So is the right to free speech. And while these are normally staples of libertarian and utilitarian thought, the fact is they are only pushed insofar as they momentarily indicate an increase of general happiness. The moment that flips, for any reason, taking those same privileges away is the moral thing to do. And again, these are privileges because utilitarianism does not give you rights. And we should add that the same right to end life, to abortion, and to free speech are not inherently problematic for deontic ethics. It really depends on your flavor of deontic ethics. And here is where our question number 12 comes in. Quote, do you believe that people are entitled to whatever they can get by their efforts? If your answer is yes, then you negate deontic ethics. Why? Because the deontic option puts external limits on you. Even if you can get at something, that alone does not give you the right to do so. But if it's all about maximizing happiness and minimizing pain, as per utilitarians, then there is no reason why not to buy votes in a society. This is all just a matter of power. And yes, those votes can be also used to marginalize you, and so on, so long as they promote general happiness. The ability of someone to make laws that benefit them at your expense is a necessary part of the utilitarian deal. Let's take the back-to-work idea during the COVID-19 crisis. The argument is that, sure, some people will die, but everyone else will be better off. That is, we're willing to kill a few thousand Americans so that the rest can be better off. If we can do so for COVID-19, why not do it for everything else? How about lowering the price of oil? How about cheaper smartphones? How about restarting the economy? Additionally, question 10 about things that we must and must not do can't be affirmed from a utilitarian position. Well, why not? Because that is a position of accepting absolutes. And utilitarianism may appear to have absolutes, but not really, because there is inherently an exception to every rule, and that is the whole point. Now notice just how badly incompatible deontic ethics are with the utilitarian position. Notice that the entire basis for the idea of right and wrong is radically different. You can't have a utilitarian approach with deontic foundations. You can't have a utilitarian foundation and deontic absolutes. The two systems actually negate each other. There is one thing you can do, however. If you have a deontic foundation and you have a variety of acceptable options, then you can use the utilitarian calculus to pick the best of the acceptable options, with the idea of best being based on something like promoting human happiness or causing least social disruption, etc. Finally, let's look at the virtue ethics. We start off with question number 10. Do you believe that there is a way in which human beings should never act and a way in which they always should? Now recall that we noted the problem of fitting in with your society. So it would seem that virtue ethics can accept anything. But that's not really the case, because the whole thing is resting on the idea of telos, and human telos is about rational balance between emotional extremes. Then you must always seek the rational mean, and you can never give yourself over to the extremes of passion on either end. Thus, you must actualize your human telos. You must not ignore it. Questions 1 and 2 regarding rights and responsibilities also relate to this foundation. You have the right to be human by telos, and thus you have the responsibility to do so. Failing to do so, for any reason, is a moral failing. Impediments to actualizing humanity by telos are ways of preventing the humanity of a person from manifesting. That is, you are making people inhuman, directly or indirectly. Finally, as regards question number 7, whether right and wrong are up to us and society, virtue ethics denies that premise. Because we are teleological beings, we are part of a teleological world. And thus also with question number 8, it's not merely a society run by agreement, but only as far as that agreement is ultimately reflective of the telos. So, while societies can contextually decide their own specific values, the highest moral values are not up for debate. They're not a matter of our agreement. They are objectively in the world. Now, the fact that each civilization has its own context to contend with means that different appropriate solutions are to be found in different places at different times and so on. So, there you have it. And you might be wondering, what happens if your answers indicate that you support incompatible theories? Well, you have two kinds of solutions available to you. From a deontic or a virtue foundation, you can use some utilitarian ideas. That is, if you have a range of acceptable actions, you are allowed to use preference-based mechanisms to determine which option you should choose. For example, let's say that you want to travel from Chicago to New York. Your travel options are driving, plane, and train. Now let's say you don't have any restrictions on the mode of transportation there, and that the travel is morally allowed. So how do you decide between these three modes of travel? Well, you can look at things like your preference for the speed at which you get there, or for your like or dislike of flying, of your possible severe anxiety when dealing with other people, and so on. And that approach may not be the most functional one with Kant per se, but other than that, you're usually good to make preference decisions or outcome decisions so long as you are within the allowed framework of actions. From a utilitarian perspective, though, you can do most things as long as they fall under that maximization of happiness and minimization of pain idea. But you can't, as in rationally cannot also believe that any such things as rights or obligations actually exist. All things, all actions must always be on the table, and that includes murder, rape, and genocide. The circumstances for those options being your best choice, so your rationally, morally defensible choices, may be difficult to find, but we have found them before. For example, you can see the use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the firebombing of Dresden, for such decisions. So, if you believe in incompatible things, your first option is that your foundation is actually deontic or Aristotelian, and you can make the utilitarian calculation work within certain situations. The key there is to understand where those apparent exceptions apply and where they don't. Your second option is that your foundation is utilitarian, in which case you actually have a full-on incompatibility. In either case, you have to decide which theory is actually your foundation, and the ideas that are incompatible with that base have to be removed. Then, if you are in the first option, your theory tells you the limits of using utilitarian thought. Or, if you're in the second option, you have to get rid of any ideas of absolute or universal rights and obligations and so on. Well, I hope that clarifies a couple of things for you. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section or shoot me an email. Thank you.